Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I will be presenting today on housing and real property activities. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please.
We already advanced this slide. It should be the first housekeeping slide. Is that not what you see?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Would you like me to do the housekeeping notes? I don't know. So you don't see.
I
you
can't,
just see the,
yeah, because all I see is the first slide.
So when I click like this, you're still not seeing anything, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I can do the housekeeping notes. Do you have a copy of the presentation that you can use for when we get to that portion?
Yes.
Okay. So audience, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. These should be familiar to you if you've attended other sessions. The PowerPoint presentations and the edited webinar recording will be available on the HUD Exchange approximately 2 to 3 weeks after the conclusion of the conference. Throughout the session, you'll be in listen-only mode, so you cannot enable audio and video. Closed captions are viewable below the video stream. You can click the Show Captions button or the Hide Captions button, depending on whether you need them, and consult the attendee guide available on the resources page on the website if you need more information. If you are going to submit questions, which we encourage you to do throughout the session, please scroll down below the captions and you will see the Q&A. Add your questions in as they occur to you. You do not need to wait until the end. If you would like to let us know of a technical issue, you can use the chat, which is to the right of the video player, or you can send an email message to eventsupport@cdmgroup.com. The email address is also listed on your screen. And if you'd like to view the Q&A side by side or on a second device or monitor, you can do so by downloading the Slido app on your phone or tablet, or going to sli.do in your browser, and you're going to enter the code 000109. It's also at the bottom of the page, and that will allow you to access the Q&A on another device. So Gloria, we are now on homeowner rehabilitation, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. Okay. That's going to be interesting that the slides aren't sliding, but I'll just proceed, I guess, as best I can with this. With regard to housing, oh, there we go. There we are. Okay, thank you so much. Okay. We're going to talk about housing activities with regard to the annual appropriation CDBG program and CDBG-CV, starting with what we call the annual appropriation CDBG program. Now, I want you to note that because of time constraints, we're only going to focus on the most prevalent housing activities like emergency rehab, energy efficiency, housing rehab, or general rehab. There are many options available for grantees that are carrying out homeowner rehabilitation, which is eligible under 57201N as in Nancy. When assisting persons with assisting households, forgive me, with homeowner rehabilitation, the assistance can be provided either as a grant or a loan. It can be a loan guarantee or interest subsidy, such as a soft second, to make it more affordable. A lot of grantees do forgivable loans, which means if the person it'll say, if you stay in the house for 10 years, then no repayments required. However, if you move out or sell before then, the loan will become due and owing. HUD does not prohibit this, and anything that does not contradict the regulations or the statute may be added, such as a requirement such as this. And with homeowner rehabilitation, it can be minor, moderate, or substantial. The regulations, our regulations don't define what is considered minor, moderate, or substantial. So those are at your discretion. But in the lead-based paint regulations in Part 35, they do kind of have a, for lack of a better term, they have definitions for these, but you're not required to follow them. When you're doing homeowner rehabilitation with CDBG, for the annual program, it doesn't require you to bring everything up to code when you're doing the rehab. You don't have to adopt property or housing standards, and you can do things to make the unit more livable for people, such as widening doors and lowering countertops so that persons with disabilities can remain in their homes. I also wanted to point out that CDBG assisted housing rehabilitation does not require compliance with what are called HQS, or housing quality standards, which are part of PIH. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about what's eligible. Okay. Of course, the cost of doing the work and the materials needed to do the work are eligible. But also these things identified here: initial homeowner warranty premium, the hazard insurance premium, flood insurance, and so forth. Those things are also what we call related eligible costs, as well, excuse me, as lead-based paint, testing, and abatement. What's not allowed is the purchase of construction equipment. That is not an eligible activity. What is allowable is what we call a tool lending program, where you may have a program where you lend tools to persons, income eligible persons, to be able to perform their own rehabilitation. A lot of grantees do not do this, I guess for various reasons, but it's an option that's available. When carrying out homeowner rehabilitation, make sure that the costs that are incurred are necessary and are reasonable in accordance with the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements, and that their rehabilitation costs are eligible. One final note, the regulations do allow refinancing under one condition. It has to be part of the rehabilitation, and it has to make that rehabilitation affordable. A grantee cannot use CDBG to refinance a loan only. It has to be a part of the rehabilitation, and the idea for doing this is so that the payment on the rehab loan plus the mortgage is at a rate that is affordable to the homeowner. Next slide, please. Reconstruction is eligible. It's not in the regs. It was authorized many years ago by statute, but it's not in our regulations. And this is the definition of reconstruction. It's considered as rehab if it's carried out under 202. It's generally rebuilding in the same lot, usually following the same footprint. Even if the structure is not there, If it's been, let's say if it was destroyed, you will still have a foundation there, and rebuilding may be carried out in that, on that foundation. Or if there is a dilapidated structure there, it can be removed and rebuilt, reconstruction can happen there. We do allow, the program does allow manufactured housing, or what some people call mobile homes. We don't but we're talking about the ones that sit on foundations. We're not talking about the ones that you can roll away whenever you want to, but we're talking about those that can be affixed. But they have to be part of the community's permanent housing stock. If not, then they cannot be CDBG assisted. Next slide, please. Now let's get into CV requirements with regard to homeowner rehabilitation. On April 30th, the tieback flexibility guide was issued and published on the HUD Exchange. And this is the guidance that was issued with regard to the use of CDBG-CV funds, which, as we all know, must address coronavirus to be eligible. You can do rehabilitation or reconstruction of privately owned homes, but it has to be by addressing living conditions, such as the ones identified here, that, if not addressed, will cause more severe COVID in those who may contract it, or poor post health outcomes. Because of these factors, if they do contract COVID, they're more likely than not to have to be hospitalized. Therefore, by addressing these, if they do end up with it, they're less likely to have a more severe outcome. Next slide, please. Okay. Multifamily or multi-unit housing, it may also be rehabilitated with CDBG funds for the annual program. It can be combined with the acquisition of property and then rehabbed, and perhaps a lot of times it's disposed of. There's no particular standard or mandate with regard to rehab of multifamily rental housing units. Historic preservation is allowed, but note that for historic preservation, you would have to work closely with your SHPO to determine what can and cannot be rehabilitated as historic preservation versus an ordinary rehab. Because while they're both under 57202 of the regulations, they have differing requirements. Also wanted to point out that conversion is allowed, or what we call renovation of closed buildings, old office buildings or retail buildings or so forth, can be turned into affordable multi-unit housing structures. We already talked about reconstructing, which is rebuilding the same structure on the same site. Next slide, please. Okay. Note that with regard to multi-unit structures, it can be privately or publicly owned. There's no requirement that they have to be owned by the grantee or a nonprofit. It can be owned by a for-profit. The idea is that at the end, a national objective will be met by the rehabilitation of the rental units. Mixed-use buildings are also allowed. There are some instances where you may have retail on the first floor and residential units on the second. That's fine. Notice that if you do this, that there are two separate activities meeting two separate national objectives, and that if you happen to rehabilitate such a building, you have to ensure that the costs are appropriated accordingly for rehabilitation of the commercial part, which is eligible either usually under 570-203 versus residential, which is 570-202. You can also have a project where they have what they call mixed income units, where it's not all LMI, where so many units are set aside for low and moderate income households. Special needs projects are allowed, but notice that when you're doing what we call temporary housing, which is facilities for persons with special needs, those are not considered permanent housing, so they can be constructed with CDBG funds. Here you're talking about your homeless shelters, you're talking about your shelters for runaway youth and those type of facilities. So the prohibition on the use of CDBG for new housing construction isn't relevant here because they're not considered permanent housing, as they're only what we call transitional or temporary housing, meaning that people are allowed to stay there for a certain number of years or months or however it is. And then at a particular point in time, they have to move on so that others may also benefit. If it's a public facility, my colleague Chelsea will talk about this later, it's eligible under 570-201C versus 202 for housing. And here it has to be owned by a local public agency or a nonprofit organization. Next slide, please. Okay, now the same flexibility that's permitted for the use of CDBG-CV to rehabilitate multifamily structures is also, single structures is also applicable to multi-unit structures. These conditions have to be present and documented if CDBG-CV will be used to rehabilitate a multifamily housing building or even a single unit. It can't be that you use, let's say, CDBG-CV to replace the kitchen floor, and only because it's old and creaky, not because it may be mold underneath. If that's the case, then such an activity that doesn't address coronavirus would be better assisted under the annual appropriation CDBG program. But if there's something there that will result in a person having a poor outcome if they end up with COVID, then that can be addressed with CDBG-CV, and the documentation of the condition must be in place. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about home purchase briefly. Now here, these are two ways to carry out home purchase activities. Usually it's done under 570-201 in or what we call home ownership assistance. Development assistance means that we're assisting with, I guess you could say, assisting the unit before it's actually ready to be occupied. When you're providing assistance to home buyers, it's either direct home ownership assistance under 201N or a public service activity, which will be subject to the public service cap. This is not something generally that would be carried out with CDBG-CV. There would have to really be an extenuating circumstance. It'd be very hard to document that it's tied back, that it's that you're doing it because of a tie back to COVID. However, remember that the Federal Register notice on CV nor the CARES Act prohibit you from carrying out activities that are eligible in our regulations and statute, provided that you can establish a clear tie back to PPR or to the addressing of coronavirus. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, you won't find these top things listed here regarding direct home ownership assistance in the regulations. They're actually in the statute at 105A25 of the Housing and Community Development Act. And as you see, there's a limit on how much down payment that can be assisted. I want to touch on this briefly. You notice the word required down payment. It's not what you want to give, what the person wants to put down or whatever. It's whatever the seller is requiring as a down payment. Half of it can be paid with CDBG funds, and it'd be up to the person to secure the rest of it with another funding source. Notice here that reasonable closing costs have to be reasonable. They're higher in some areas of the country than others, but they have to be reasonable for the area in which, it's being carried out. The principal write down is really what we call soft seconds. Actually, if someone's occupying the unit already, usually as a rental, and they want to purchase and they're making purchase available, assistance can be provided to help them acquire the home versus being a renter, the one that they're occupying, not just any other. Also, they can acquire mortgage guarantees and private mortgage insurance. Now, notice that if you're doing a public service, it's only down payment assistance. When you look at these 5 things, if you're doing it as a public service, only the first one is eligible. But note, if you're doing a public service, down payment assistance is not limited to up to 50% of the required down payment. If it's a public service under 57201E, it's not limited, but it must be reasonable. However, considering that public services such as this are subject to the cap, a lot of grantees do not use this to fund down payment assistance. However, they may do so. Individual development accounts are another resource available to persons interested in purchasing a home. They're dedicated savings accounts. And what usually happens is that the person is required to contribute so much, usually on a monthly basis, and it's matched by another entity. Generally, it will be matched. It can be matched with CDBG, and some also use a third agency, such as Health and Human Services Assets for Independence Program, as a third source. So what's happening is that the person may be saving this, but they're getting, they're a match from 2 sources, which will help them to save as much as they need to be able to make the down payment, pay their closing or whatever it is. They do have to be income eligible, is in the same way under 57201N. The statute actually states, well, yes, it does. It says that the assistance provided under 57201N is limited to low and moderate income households. So you can't do individual development accounts for your average person who makes over 80% of the area's median income. It has to be, as in 57201N, a low and moderate income household. And it doesn't have to, there's no limit on how long The IDA may exist. It may take some people 5 years to save up enough money, and it may take some people 3 years. It's up to the grantee. It's up to you to decide how long, if you have this in place, you would allow beneficiaries to save money and receive the matching contributions. Next slide, please. Okay, notice we mentioned briefly development assistance for home ownership. Grantees can use CDBG to acquire property for the purpose of rehabilitating it and then, selling them to low and moderate income households. Also, there's a provision in 570-202B that allows just about anyone, for-profits, nonprofits, individuals, to purchase for the purpose of rehabilitation housing units and then ensuring that they're either sold or rented to low and moderate income households once the rehabilitation has been completed. Now, with the developers who are developing affordable housing that will be occupied by low and moderate income households, activities that support those units but are not considered new construction are eligible to assist the developer in being able to build the affordable housing. The cost of acquiring the land, but if you notice here, it has to be a nonprofit or public developer. Infrastructure costs, the cost of installing the water, the sewer lines that will go to the units, and the plumbing and other things that are built down into the foundation and extend to the street, that connect. All of those things can be CDBG assisted, but as it states here, it's very important that the property be in public ownership, which means either owned by the grantee or a nonprofit entity. Also, if the land needs to be cleared, perhaps it's environmentally contaminated in some way, or there's substandard units on it that need demolition, those are separate activities that can be assisted with CDBG. Clearance and demolition are eligible under 570-201D as in dog. And it involves the removal of the rubble also once the demolition has occurred. Next slide, please. Okay, we talked about new housing construction, and as we all know, you can't use CDBG for that unless it's carried out by a qualified CBDO. Here, the state regulation is cited, section 105-815. But for the entitlement program, CBDOs have to meet the requirements of 570-204C to be considered an eligible CBDO. Also, another way that housing can be constructed with CDBG is for the housing of last resort under URA. If there's nowhere to move people that are being displaced because of URA, because perhaps where their buildings are being, torn down and rebuilt, or they're doing extensive rehabilitation, whatever it is, and people have to be relocated, which is also statutory. There's an exception there. And also for special needs facilities, such as homeless shelters and so forth. Now, with regard to supporting new housing construction, which can be done, but not the new construction itself, as we mentioned before, you can acquire the property. If you acquire it with CDBG, you can dispose of it with CDBG. If you don't acquire it with CDBG, you can't use CDBG to dispose of it. Those two go hand in hand. As we talked about before, site clearance and assemblage, which was your demolition. Site assemblage actually means if you have adjoining parcels and you want to put them together for the purpose of having one huge site to construct housing units, that's what site assemblage is. And what that means is that you're acquiring the adjoining property from the owner so that you can have a lot big enough. Let's say if you want to build 10 houses and you only have room enough for 5 and you need the additional land next door and they sell it to you, and then, okay, then you've assembled, the site has been assembled and is ready for the work to be done. Site improvements, like we talked about, the water, the sewer, and things of that nature. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about CV new housing construction. This is also from the new guidance on the PPR tieback flexibility. Well, actually, it's not new anymore, but it was issued maybe about 9 months ago. It has to respond to residential overcrowding associated with the spread of COVID and with more severe COVID disease and poor health outcomes. And in addition, it has to be part of a neighborhood revitalization project carried out by CBDO. So the requirement for it to be carried out by CBDO was not waived by the CARES Act. That must still occur. But if you decide to do this, it has to be clearly documented that there's residential overcrowding and there's nowhere else for them to go. There are no available, let's say, apartments for folk to move out and rent, or there's nothing available for them to nowhere for them to go. And we all know that residential overcrowding increases the likelihood of contracting COVID and spreading it through the house. And as you know, some people living in a residential unit may have maybe immunocompromised or may have had chemo or something. And if they end up with COVID, they're going to have a more severe outcome than a person who has not. And so if all of this can be documented, clearly documented, and there's a CBDO involved, then CDBG-CV can be used for new housing construction, but only in this instance. Next slide, please. Okay. Here's something else that's generally eligible under what we call the annual appropriation CDBG program. Usually would not be something that may be CV assisted. However, as I'll repeat again, we don't prohibit anything that's eligible in our regulations and statute as long as it can be clearly tied back to PPR. Things like housing services are eligible. Public services where people come and they're acquiring information on housing, referral services and so forth. That can be an eligible public service activity. However, if it doesn't address COVID, it's subject to the cap. Also, it can be what we call a program activity delivery cost of another activity. Generally, it may be eligible as program. It can be program delivery even for people who are seeking to purchase a home, for example. Also, it's a separate activity under 570-201K. when the activities are linked to home program activities. Note here that home income limits are applicable, but that's eligible under 570-201K as in height. And if you want to know what those activities are, you have to go to Section 105A21 of the Housing and Community Development Act. If you go to 201K, it'll refer you to 105A20, but it's A21. Okay. Also, we talked about public services. Naturally, they have to meet a national objective, but particularly if they can meet area benefit or limited clientele, they may be eligible. And like I said, they can also be part of a CDBG or home housing activity. For home, you have tenant-based rental assistance and other things that are not eligible under CDBG. I can't repeat this enough. In CDBG, although we have emergency grant assistance to help with rent, CDBG is not a rental assistance program. Too many people confuse that, think that CDBG can be used for that and CV, but no, only as emergency grant assistance as outlined in the notice, the August 20th Federal Register notice. Next slide, please. Okay, these are other activities that generally are applicable to real property. Of course, acquisition, which is 570-201A, but meeting a national objective for such an activity depends on its in use. You know, a temporary use, it can, excuse me, it can meet a national objective based on what we call short-term temporary use, but it's the final use that's going to determine what national objective will be used for that activity. We already talked about acquiring property for housing. If it's done with CV, it has to respond to the residential overcrowding, the same as we discussed before when we were talking about the use of CDBG for new housing construction. For CV, it has to respond to residential overcrowding. As mentioned before, disposition of real property. It has to be property that was assisted with CDBG, generally acquired and or improved. We always say if you didn't acquire it with CDBG, then you can't dispose of it with CDBG. But assisted with CDBG means that it may have been improved with CDBG. Some of the costs that are allowable for disposition are listed below. Temporarily maintaining a property until it's sold is eligible. There have been more than enough questions on what is considered temporarily maintaining real property until it's disposed of. The regulations don't give a specific time period for that. However, we go back to the reasonable standard in 2 CFR Part 200. It has to be reasonable. It has to be reasonable for the conditions. You know, we have grantees that have been maintaining property for over 10 years. Now, that generally wouldn't be considered reasonable. However, if they have extenuating circumstances and can document them, that's different. But it's handled, something like that would be handled on a case-by-case basis. But generally, when you're disposing of property, you do have legal costs and you got costs for advertising it, for sale, you know, working with a realtor to dispose of it. And also having people to keep it up, like I said, temporarily, while it's in the process of being sold. Next slide, please. Code enforcement. Code enforcement is something that in the annual appropriation CDBG program has caused a lot of confusion for different reasons. But we're talking first the annual program. Okay, they can pay for the cost of code enforcement or enforcing codes in a deteriorated or deteriorating area. That area has to meet that requirement in accordance with state or local law. And they can even use some of the standards in 57208B1 to document that. But the next requirement is that there must be a plan or something in place to arrest the deterioration of that area by making public or private improvements or providing services to the area. A lot of grantees do code enforcement, mainly on residential structures. Some do it on commercial and residential. I mean, with CDBG, as long as it meets deteriorated in accordance with state or local law, and it has to meet, the area has to meet a national objective, generally area benefit as well. And not every area that's deteriorating or deteriorated may meet area benefit, but that's a whole nother question. We'll get into that in a few minutes. The eligible costs for code enforcement include the inspection costs, the salaries involved in that, along with the overhead. For example, some of them have to wear uniforms of a specific uniform or specific boots, or have mechanisms to record what they find. You know, those type of costs are allowed, but they have to be tied directly to code enforcement only in CDBG eligible areas. Also, the enforcement itself, the salaries of the code inspectors, but only for the time that they're carrying it out in CDBG eligible areas. You can't use CDBG to pay a code enforcement inspector that inspects citywide or countywide. It has to be for the portion of time that they spend doing it in a CDBG eligible area. So if they split their time between the two, then half of their salary can be paid with CDBG, as well as legal costs, because if fines are assessed, there's usually an appeal process, and that may require a hearing. So all of those legal costs tied to that would also be eligible. But like a broken record, has to be a CDBG eligible area. The actual cost of correcting the violations are not eligible under 202, which is where you'll find code enforcement. But they may, depending on what needs to be done, it may be eligible as rehabilitation. A lot of the ones for housing are housing rehabilitation, but not all of them. It depends on what state or local law determines our priorities for enforcing codes. Next slide, please. Okay. Generally, as I said before, it has to be area benefit, but it doesn't have to be. It can be slum blight area basis too. The requirements, they're listed here. They're 572A(b)(1). Not only must the residents of the service area for the code enforcement assisted with CDBG has to be 51% LMI, but I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, area must be deteriorated or deteriorating in accordance with state or local law, or either meet the standards at 208B1. If they meet those standards, They can also use the slum blight area national objective. Keeping in mind, as James mentioned earlier on a different presentation, that we have the 70% overall benefit requirement, which means that 70% of a grant over a 1, 2, or 3 year period as determined by the grantee has to be spent for activities that benefit LMI persons. So any slum blight area or spot or any activity that doesn't meet meet benefit to low and moderate income persons has to be taken, that to keep the overall benefit requirement in mind if they're choosing to use slum blight. Next slide, please. Okay. We talked about code enforcement. Let's move on to lead-based paint. This is a separate activity in our regulations under 202F as in Frank. CDBG can be used to evaluate units for the purpose of reducing lead hazards in housing. These 4 activities identified here are eligible. But if they're going to address it, then it's also eligible under this category. But they can also just use CDBG to evaluate if they would like and use a different source to mitigate it, but they don't have to. They can also, if the household is LMI, then they may also do the abatement as well. But if it's to the point where they can't remain in the unit while the work's being done, then relocation costs will also have to be made on their behalf, which in this case would be an activity delivery cost of the 570-202F lead-based paint. Next slide, please. Okay, let's get into the CV requirements. There was a whole lot of confusion over this when it came out. And I'm going to try my best to explain it so that you understand, but feel free always to ask questions. Okay, as you all know, and I mentioned before, grantees can make emergency grant payments for rental mortgage for up to 6 consecutive months. When that happens, if they do it for the entire 6 months, that's over 100 days, and that kicks in this requirement here at 24 CFR 35, 115A11. And what that says is that the requirements of subpart K of this part, meaning 570, do not apply if the assistance being provided is emergency rental assistance or foreclosure prevention assistance, provided, this is the key language, provided that this exemption shall expire for a dwelling unit no later than 100 days after the initial payment of or assistance. So if they're going to do it for 100 days or more, then this regulation requirement kicks in. The exemption will expire on that 100th day. And so if they, if you're providing emergency grant assistance, let's say to an individual for 3 months, 3 months is generally 90 days unless it's November or June, month for 30 days. But in general, we will say around 90 days. So that will not trigger it. However, if you do it for the next month, you're going to pass the 100 days, and this requirement will kick in. So when does this emergency grace period start? It starts at the time payment is made going forward. Once the assistance period reaches 100 days, the visual lead-based paint inspection is required. So if they want to continue to use CV money for emergency grant assistance past 100 days, usually within the 4 to 6 months, then they have to do the visual layer-based paint inspection. Now, note that because of coronavirus restrictions, it may not always be possible to do an on-site inspection. And if that's the case, then the owner or a surrogate, and it doesn't state who may be the surrogate, may perform a remote visual inspection. So if this is something that affects you, you are encouraged to make sure you have policies and procedures in place that allow on-site visual inspection or remote visual inspection, however you choose to do it. And you have to be able to document that it occurred. I'm pretty sure we'll see some questions on that, but we'll move forward. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, historic preservation. That's something that's eligible under 202D as in dog. It can be carried out with CV, but only if there's a clear tie back to addressing coronavirus. For activities such as this, that may be a harder thing to do, but it's not prohibited. For historic preservation, you can't just rehab the whole structure. If you're going to do it under historic preservation, it has to be things that will preserve the historic features of a property, whether it's public property or private property. Rehab, different things that may have deteriorated over the years and they need to be restored. However, anytime you're doing historic preservation, you need to make sure that it's listed, or, you have to make sure it's listed. It's not a wish, because some they'll say, yeah, this is historic property, but you need to make sure that it's such and that it's listed in the National Register of Historic Places or in a state or local inventory that identifies historic places in that state. If it's designated by a state or local landmark as historic, that's also acceptable. Next slide, please. Okay. This slide probably should have been somewhere else in here, but when we were talking about renovation of closed buildings with regular or annual appropriation CDBG, we talked about renovating closed buildings, like old schools or old office buildings or retail establishments into housing units. That can be done either to develop a homeless shelter or what we call permanent housing units, because it's not new construction. You have a structure already there in place. It just wasn't a housing structure before. However, it's being converted into one. So it's not considered new housing construction, which is prohibited. So if you're going to do it with CV, it's allowable with CV, but you have to be able to tie it back by showing how you're addressing residential overcrowding. And so new affordable housing is needed, and you have an old building that can be converted. If you can tie it back to addressing coronavirus, then you will be able to use CV for the conversion versus annual appropriation CDBG, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. Okay, we've already talked about what's ineligible briefly. We talked about new construction. That we all know. Direct mortgage guarantees, you can't use CDBG to pay for mortgage insurance or mortgage guarantees. We talked at the beginning about construction equipment, that would be used in rehabilitation or even perhaps new construction. Now, we talked about emergency grant payments, and that's what this is here. My colleague will touch on this in more detail during the afternoon sessions as public service, because that's what mortgage or utility payments, as stated here, it's considered emergency grant assistance. If you go to 570, 207B4, when you're talking about the annual appropriation program, it's allowed for up to 3 consecutive months there. It has to be an emergency. It can't be, oh, I partied away my money and now I can't pay my rent. It has to be an emergency. You lost your job, something. It has, but it can be done for up to 3 consecutive months. But as you all know, the payment has to be made directly to the service provider, either the mortgage holder or the landlord. It's not done regularly, and I haven't seen it done, but it can be done as a loan, requiring the beneficiary to pay the money back. But I have yet to see a grantee that's ever had an emergency grant assistance program provided as a loan. It's an option, but doesn't mean they have to. Of course, anything that CBDOs do that may not be otherwise eligible, they are not subject to all the restrictions that grantees and subrecipients would be. But generally, grantees, at least in my experience, most use nonprofits to operate the emergency grant assistance programs if they do have them. I was told this is the last slide. Do we have any questions? I'm pretty sure there are a lot in the Q&A because I don't have anybody assisting me. I didn't have anybody able to field the questions while I was speaking. So I will address these. Okay, are you at the top? Okay, thank you. What type of record keeping is required for meeting the national objective of multifamily rental housing? Do you income qualify the initial renter once, or is it an annual verification? Okay. For the CDBG program, its national objective compliance is determined at what we call initial occupancy. That means that after the assistance has been provided and the families move in, they are required to ensure that 51% of them are low and moderate income households. After that, anyone can move in because the CDBG program does not have a provision for checking income every 6 months or every year like home does. But what some grantees do is they'll put a clause in their, with their agreement with the property owner that it has to, and they can do it. They can do it because it's not illegal, but they can say that this property must be 51% occupied by LMI households for 10 years. And If that's in the contract, it's enforceable because it doesn't contradict the regulations. It's called imposing a period of affordability, which is not required in CDBG, even though I wish it was, but no. Did that answer your question? I presume it did. Okay, let's go to the next. Would graffiti removal, which is general public service, qualify as rehab? I'm trying to stay within my cap. Graffiti removal is usually looked at as a public service. The only way it would be looked at rehab, you would have to somehow, how do I say this? It would take more extensive work than just painting over it. You know, even though painting is considered rehab, usually graffiti removal is probably washing it away or use this type of special cleaner to remove the graffiti. Generally, that's not rehab. But if you had to, oh my goodness, let's see, if you had siding that you had to replace because you couldn't get it off, something like that would probably be rehab because you have to, for lack of a better term, you have to do work on part of the unit that's integral to its structure. You know, the siding, unless it's brick underneath, I don't think you can not have the siding there. Okay, Nicole, I see Nicole. Can CDBG-CV be used for connecting water and septic to a single family houses that do not have running water? The only way you can do that, okay, that's a rehab activity under 570-202. I'm trying to do it by memory. But it's a rehab activity to hook housing units up, existing housing units, to water, public water and sewer. The only way you can do it and do it as CV, you would have to clearly be able to document how doing so would respond to addressing coronavirus. I mean, is the water from the septics, I mean, you know, well water and all that? I mean, is it contaminated? Is there some type of issue with it that if someone used it and contracted COVID, it would cause a worse outcome? If you can clearly tie it back to the pandemic, yes. Otherwise, it's very highly recommended that you do this under the Annual Appropriation CDBG program. Remember, though, that it has to meet a national objective. So if you're doing it for single units, each household has to be low and moderate income. If commercial space is part of mixed use, is it economic development or housing rehab? It's economic development. It's economic development under 570-203A. It can be B if owned by a for-profit, but generally it may be A because 203A addresses the rehab of commercial space. Okay. When you're citing codes, can you repeat it twice? I'm not sure what you mean. Are you saying, can they cite someone for the same violation? That's a state or local thing. We don't, HUD doesn't get into that. Now, as far as doing it in a CDBG eligible area, you would work to get that addressed versus continuing to cite them. Like, for example, if you're doing doing code inspections for housing on Main Street, and you're saying, okay, these the electrical systems are insufficient. Let's pick something, because we prefer that when you're doing code enforcement, that you focus on buildings and the problems in buildings versus overgrown overgrown weeds and trash and cars on blocks and things like that. It's preferable, but not mandated, that you can only do buildings. But the regulations and the notice prefer buildings over yards and so forth. So that's something you would have to determine, I guess, with your state or local ordinances and requirements about repeating it twice. But generally with CDBG, you would not, because remember, it says that together with the enforcement, you have to have something in place. Well, you have to be planning to do something to arrest the deterioration. So that means that if you cite someone for, electrical problems in the home and they're eligible, you can say, well, you can hire a contractor on your own to fix the electrical problem. Or if they become eligible, you can say, look, you can get a rehab loan under CDBG under 202 to fix the electrical problems. And that will arrest that deterioration of that unit so that you don't have to repeat it twice. Okay. When is home ownership assistance a public service? Only down payment assistance is allowed as a public service. And the only thing that's allowed with the down payment, it doesn't have to be 50%. It can be any amount for the down payment assistance. The Part 200 requirements just require that the amount be reasonable that's being provided. Now, keep in mind, if you use CDBG to do home ownership assistance via down payment assistance as a public service, you're going to hit your cap very quickly. And you're not going to be able to probably do as many other public services as you like. Because the idea is to be able to assist, all the LMI folk in your area. And if you're focusing on this one public service, that won't happen. So a lot of grantees don't do it. I mean, they can, but they don't. And the cap is usually the reason why. Next question, please. I think that. Uh-oh. If you purchase 2 tiny homes already made, this isn't considered new. No, it's not. If they're already up, no. Doesn't matter what kind of home, tiny home, regular size home. If someone wanted to use CDBG for home ownership assistance under 201N to acquire a brand new home, that's not prohibited. The requirement, however, is that it must be on the market and available to everybody. It can't be that this house was built just for this family or just for this household. The house has, they have to be on the open market. And then you can use CDBG funds for that. Insurance required? No. no. That's something that you can, because for some homes, they may be paid for and they're paying property tax and maybe not have insurance and can't afford it. So, in a case like that, it may not be wise to say, well, you don't have any homeowners insurance, therefore we're not rehabilitating your home. However, if state or local law requires it, then the answer will probably then be yes, because if it's a local or state law, if it's a requirement, then yes, it would have to be. But in general, no. IDA, okay. Yes, it can be used if you have an IDA. You can use it for anything associated with buying a house, with home ownership assistance, let's say under 201N. Because when you're doing the IDIA, there's no such eligible activity in the regs or statute as IDIA. Because an IDA can be used also for education, and it can also be used for economic development for starting a business. So it would have to be clear that if a person has more than one IDA, let's say they want to go back to school, that they have a separate one for education, that's different. That's a public service. But for buying a house, that's 201N. So yes, it can pay the down payment and the closing costs and so forth. With regard to home, I do not know. I recommend that you contact somebody in the Office of Affordable Housing Programs and headquarters to determine if that can happen. Okay. No limit for IDA, but best on L. Okay. Some grantees do continue to check the income of the people saving the money, and if they are determined to be ineligible at that time, what will happen is that they will get back their investment. And the money from CDBG that was contributed will go back to the program. And if there's an HHS or some other agency match, that money will go back to them. The issue is that the regs don't require an annual check of income. It's recommended though, highly recommended, particularly if the savings program is going to be for like 3 or 4 years, because a lot can happen in that amount of time. So it's recommended, but not required, that grantees check income of people with IDEAs at least annually. Okay. The only other one I know specifically, it's done by the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's called Assets for Independence Program. HHS probably has other programs that can be used for a match, depending on whether, depending on what, what else they have. But you may have other federal agencies like the Department of Education that help with education IDIAs, for example. Or what's the name of it? Or Department of Commerce for Economic Development, IDAs, where persons saving money to open a business or start a business. CDBG, okay. Homelessness as a result of COVID. I would need more information on that particular instance to address it. But generally overcrowding means that there's so many, people in the house that it's almost impossible to social distance to avoid COVID. Okay, combine code enforcement with demo. Okay, demo. Okay. If you're doing, let's say, okay, we're gonna look at this twofold. You can't combine code enforcement with anything first. The demolition is a separate activity under 57201D as in dog. And grantees can use CDBG to demo property and meet the slum blight area or spot national objective. Not because it's been cited for code enforcement, but because they've examined it and found it to be so. I mean, you have in some areas abandoned housing, what I call abandoned housing units, where the conditions were so bad that, the person moved and the owner lived somewhere else. And the grantee looks up the owner of record and writes them and says, look, this property has been found to be out of compliance with our, building codes. And you have, let's say, 6 months to fix it up or we're going to tear it down. And they keep trying to contact that owner and have no response. Then they'll demo it. But if it's slum blight, that's fine, because you have the eligible activity 201D, you have a national objective, elimination of slum and blight. Keep in mind though that when property is cleared, it's usually intended for another use. And when that happens, it's subject to the CDBG change of use requirements, which means that if you change the use of the property, let's say now you decided you're going to turn it into a park, we had to demolish, it's like so many, houses, and we have enough for a small park. And we're going to turn this land, this cleared land into a park. You have to go before your citizens via substantial amendment, let them know that you plan to use CDBG to turn this into a park, and it will meet the LMA national objective. As long as you change it into a use that's eligible and meets a national objective, that's fine. There will be no repayment necessary. But if you decide later that it's going to be used for something that won't meet a national objective, then repayments required in compliance with 570-505 if owned by the grantee, and 503B7 if it's owned by a nonprofit subrecipient. I don't know anything about, oh, I'm sorry. Areas eligible low mod. You should have, you can use GIS. I don't know how to use it, so I can't advise you on that. but you have census maps and other software that you can use to determine the service area for an activity to ensure that it meets the low and moderate income area benefit national objective. Under CV, can you acquire housing units that will be used as affordable rental housing only for homeowners? Okay. If you're acquiring CV, if you're using CV to acquire housing units for the purpose of alleviating overcrowding, for, you know, which is the standard, you can use it for either one. It doesn't matter. You can use it for either one, but just remember, if you're using CDBG to acquire, let's say, a multi-unit structure to alleviate overcrowding, then you can either use it for affordable rental housing, or I guess if you do home ownership, then that would be condos, which then would probably require a lot of rehab. So it's up to the grantee, as long as you ensure that you can establish the clear tie back to addressing the pandemic. Can you use CDBG-CV for acquisition of housing? Code enforcement based on LMI areas of public service activity. No, it is not. Code enforcement is separate. It's eligible under 570-202C as in cat. It is not a public service. It's a separate activity under the broad rehab regulations in 202. It's 202C, and no apology necessary, but it's not a public service. It's just that you have to make sure that it's being used for the eligible purposes identified in 202C. Relocation. Anytime you're going to use CDBG funds to that requires work necessary for people to relocate, relocations allowed. Look at 570-606. It talks about that in more detail. What it is, if you're doing any type of CDBG work that requires people to move temporarily or permanently, CDBG can be used to pay the necessary relocation to move them while the work's being done. Or let's say if they're tearing it down and they can't come back to it, then yes, they can use CDBG to pay relocation costs. All right, okay. This area does cause a lot of confusion. Okay. You can only pay for the salary of a code enforcement officer. It's not that the area is 51% LMI. The area has to be deteriorated or deteriorating in accordance with state or local law. It has to meet that definition to be eligible for CDBG assisted code enforcement. If there's no definition, there are standards in 570-208B2 for slum blight. I'm sorry, B1, that talk about what's considered slum and blighted that may be used to state that an area is deteriorated or deteriorating. Some areas that meet that definition are LMI and some are not. But if you're going to use the LMA national objective, then that area has to be 51% LMI. It must be. But if it's not deteriorating or deteriorated, no code enforcement with CDBG. What year does the lead-based paint affect? Pre-19? No. If you're using either 2019 or 2020 or CDBG CV funds to provide emergency grant assistance to an individual or household for up to 6 consecutive months, and it's 100 days or more, depending, because some people won't need the whole 6 months. Some people may only need 2 months, 3 months, which is about 90 days. But once you hit that 4th month, you're going to go into 100 days. So it doesn't matter whether you're using 2019, 2020, or CV money for the emergency grant payment assistance. Once you do it for more than 100 days, then the requirements at Part 35 kick in. Payment of delinquent rent does not count toward the 100 days. That's correct. Yes, because you're going forward with the help. That's why. Because what happened in the past was the past, but it's the assistance going forward. Is there a cost cap to determine whether abatement measures are mandatory versus interim controls for, okay. If you're going to use CV for addressing lead-based paint or to remediate it, first of all, you have to clearly be able to tie that back to the pandemic. And that's when you get into the condition, like I said, the mold or the lead-based paint and so forth. So yes, but you have to go to the Part 35 regulations to determine what the abatement measures are. It depends on how much money you're spending. It's from 0 to 5,000 is one, 5,001 to I think it's 24,999, and then 25 and over is 3 categories. But they're in Part 35, so you'll have to go there to determine what abatement measures are needed and the costs associated with those. Okay, arrearages plus current payment could be paid as month 1. That is correct. But what if those arrearages were over 6 months? Does it still count at month 1? No, it doesn't count as the 6 months. If you're paying, let's say you're paying, because it says you can pay arrearages plus the current and then go forward. So if you pay, let's say 7 months of arrearages, and the current month, that's month 1. The rest of the months are going forward. A subrecipient has emergency assistance program, paying for rent or utilities. Okay, so that emergency grant assistance. What is required after the visual inspection? This question looks to be a 2-part question. Okay, with 2 different subjects. Because they're not, okay. Once they do, okay, because like I said, everybody's not going to need the assistance long enough to trigger the requirements. But if they do, after the visual inspection, then they're required to address it. And then that's when you get into the Part 35 regulations to determine what needs to be done. No. A low mod multifamily unit is found at drug manufacturing. Can it relocate? No, definitely not. Because that's illegal activity. No. It had usually relocation is triggered if you're paying, let's say if CDBG is used either to substantially rehabilitate or demolish a housing unit. But remember, relocation is also applicable to businesses and other entities. The answer is relocation, doing a rehab. Yes, if the level of rehab requires that the person can't stay in that home while that rehab is being carried out, then CDBG can be used to pay for the relocation. Whether or not the rehab pertains to lead-based paint or not, doesn't matter. It can be any type of rehab that requires the person to be displaced from the housing unit. Okay, yeah, there are things, okay, direct home ownership does have PMI and other stuff. There's some things you can pay and some things, but a direct mortgage guarantee is different. Okay, let me see if I can explain it well. You know, the person went to Chase Bank to get a mortgage. And Chase says, well, we're not going to give you this loan unless HUD guarantees it. And that's what's not allowed. If they want HUD to guarantee the mortgage, then that's FHA. That's a whole nother program. And then they would have to get an FHA loan. But direct mortgage guarantees with CDBG is not an eligible cost. While project ownership of multifamily rental may be public or private, it must be a nonprofit or for public use. A for-profit developer cannot use CDBG funds, right? Okay. When a multifamily building is being rehabilitated, it can be owned by a for-profit, or it can be owned by a nonprofit. It's rare that a grantee will own a multifamily rental building. They may own it long enough to perhaps rehab it, but then they end up selling it to either a for-profit or a nonprofit, because grantees generally are not in the rental business of renting property, you know, housing units. So that said, building multifamily rental unit can be owned by anyone. But with regard to for-profit using CDBG funds, there's a provision in 570-202B1 that allows a developer to acquire housing property for with the intent to rehabilitate it and then provide it either as rental or ownership for a low and moderate income household. That's the provision that allows CDBG to be awarded to for-profits with regard to housing. I may have to maybe copy the language somewhere. Okay. If you purchase a fee but not located on a parcel. No, that's not considered new construction. That's not new construction. But usually to be part of the community's permanent housing stock, it's not usually owned by a person unless it's being rehabilitated. But if it's home ownership assistance, it may be owned by someone else, but it's not new construction. Historic preservation. 24 CFR 570-202D as in dog. Yes, yes. If a client comes to you and can provide current documentation, I'm not talking about something 5 years old, a current documentation showing that they are participating or eligible for SNAP or Section 8 or what have you. That can be used as a way to document that person as low and moderate income because they had to income qualify under those other programs that have income requirements that are similar to or more stringent than the CDBG income requirements. Can a nonprofit or CBDOK outtake for site clearance for affordable housing? Okay. The answer is no, because if you're going to use generally nonprofits that do site clearance or assemblage or anything to support the development of affordable housing, to do those improvements, it has to be in public ownership. The answer is no. No, the IDA cannot be rolled over into another type of savings like an IRA. Yes, if that's required to bring them current and avoid eviction, yes. Late fees can be. A lot of landlords, because of the pandemic, waived them, but some did not. But whatever the amount that was needed to keep, to make them current and avoid the eviction is what has to be paid with the CDBG-CV, because the idea of an emergency grant payment is to prevent something. And in this case, you're preventing eviction. Okay. When you talk about partnering with another department in the city to rehab a building, if we're splitting the cost, the building will be used as a test investment. Okay. Those are two separate things. Those are two separate types of public facilities. And when you say another department, I'm presuming you mean another city department. This is one of those questions that will take more time because more information is needed. What department? What require? Generally when grantees carry out activities, they can use another local public agency that they designate, which can be another department, to carry out an activity. But generally, if it's a CDBG eligible activity that will meet a national objective, generally there's not a partnership unless the other department is actually running it. But without further information, it's kind of hard to say yes without more. But yes, testing and vaccination site building, that can be a public facility, and a police substation can be too. It's not clear to me though how a police substation would address coronavirus. Hence the need for additional information. No. Nope, the regulations statute require for at least entitlement grantees. I can't speak to the state program, but I can speak for entitlements. Generally, each entitlement grantee receives its own grant, same for CV. And in order to carry out an activity outside of its jurisdiction, it would have to meet the provisions at 57309 to do so. And if it's another entitlement, that generally would be very difficult to do because it's not, because like I said, they each receive their own grant. Now, what people can do, like let's say adjoining entitlements, they can partner on something. They could, let's say, you know, if they wanted to construct a homeless shelter, that would be 50-50, then they would have to draw up an agreement. It's complicated to explain, but I'm gonna try to do it quickly. But they can use CDBG, each contributing the amount of money in proportion to how their residents, to the number of residents that it will benefit. You know, it doesn't have to be 50-50, it can be something else. So if they're doing 50-50, jurisdiction A would do 50% of the cost and jurisdiction B would do the other 50. And that means that the beneficiaries would have to be, 50% of them would have to be from A and 50 from B. But all together, you have to ensure that 51% are LMI. Oh my God. There actually is guidance from justice on the use of CDBG to assist felons. And I would have to find it and make it available, but I think the answer to your question about the child molester, oh my God, I'm sorry, my bias is creeping in. I hate that type of thing. I would have to find that guidance and provide it with regard to assisting someone convicted of any type of felony. My email, I don't know if I want to make it available nationwide. My responsibilities in my office are for handling regions 4 and 5. Region 4 is the South and Caribbean, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, those areas, and the Midwest, such as, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, in that area. I have colleagues that address questions from other areas. We all have what we call geographic assignments. And questions from regions 4 and 5, I will be more than happy to address later. But as far as this is concerned, I guess until they tell me to stop, I'll continue to address your questions here. Actually, the accepted sources, it can be any program that has the same income restrictions as CDBG. It can be Section 8, it can be SNAP, it can be an HHS program that they qualify under. It can be TANF, it can be anything that has the same income restrictions as CDBG, or even if they're even more stringent. They can have a letter stating that they've been determined eligible for Section 8 housing and they have been placed on a waiting list. That's sufficient because it shows that they were income qualified there and found to be income eligible. Please advise the ownership of the equipment. Use a C, okay. I'm not sure what that question means. It's kind of vague. But generally, CDBG and CV can't be used to buy equipment unless it's part of an activity as an activity delivery cost, or if it's necessary to carry out a public service. Okay, I don't know who told you that you couldn't pay late fees. But if a person pays or receives assistance to pay everything but the late fees, they're not current. And that means the landlord can still evict them. So that's why we say that late fees are eligible. I don't know if perhaps the, I can't remember the name, the American Recovery Program has that requirement, or some other program has that requirement, but I would have to look and find, well, actually, no, I take that back. In the resources, there's a guide on providing emergency grant payment and arrearages. You can consult that document to get additional guidance on late fees and so forth when making emergency grant payments. Additional information on the testing site for COVID, okay. And police substation, okay. If they're using their money to rehab their portion, then it's not subject to our program requirements because it's not CDBG or CDBG-CV money. If you have a building with multiple uses, you can use CDBG and CV on the part that's being used to carry out an eligible activity meeting a national objective. Looking at this building here, if you had, let's say the first floor was the testing site for COVID, and the second floor was the police substation, the third floor, let's say that it was a different type of public service being provided on that floor. If you're gonna use CV for the COVID testing site, whatever, using my example, you would have to use CV to only cover the cost of rehabbing the portion of the building being used for the testing site. I can't speak to ESG CV. You would have to contact the Office of Special Needs Assistance to get additional information on that. That question on the CDBG DR to Neil Parker, who's the Director of Disaster, the Office of Disaster Recovery and Special Issues, will answer that question. If a sub purchased equipment necessary to carry out, the government entity is to share the ownership. The regulations, the Part 200 regulations govern equipment and how it's to be treated. It can return the equipment to the grantee once it's finished, or the grantee may allow it to keep it if it pays the current market value of the item. But all of that would have to be made clear in the agreement between the subrecipient and the grantee. But I think the Part 200 requirements are in 203.11, somewhere along in that line. But no, it's owned by the subrecipient. If the grantee gives the subrecipient the money to pay for it, it belongs to the subrecipient, but the agreement will determine whether or not it has to be returned or if they can pay to keep it. Okay, I think I've already addressed that question about the homeless shelters. And when I was talking about partnering, so we can move on. I've already addressed that one. Sub-grantee, you're talking about a sub-recipient purchase tools or equipment. The regulations at 570-207 say generally equipment can't be purchased with CDBG. The grantee and or the subrecipient may do so if it's necessary to carry out the activity and or if it constitutes all of a public service activity, if it's very necessary to carry out a public service activity. Is the city required to designate the tier, okay, in order to do the code enforcement? Okay. The city can designate whatever, as long as it's not the entire city. They can designate an area as deteriorating or deteriorated as long as it meets that definition in state or local law and or the standards in 570-208B1. And you can use mapping software to document those areas.
Gloria, that's the last question that was submitted.
Okay. Okay. All right, I guess I'm through until I'll come back on for Chelsea.
Okay, sounds great. So we'll conclude this session and resume with the next session at 1:45 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all
All
for attending.
right. All right, you have a good day. Bye-bye.